Think about the last day you had with absolutely nothing you had to do. No meetings, no deadlines, no commitments waiting for you. A completely free day. How long did it take before you found something to do? For most people, the answer is less than they'd like to admit. Within a few minutes, sometimes just seconds, the urge appears to organize something, to check a message that could have waited, to start a project that wasn't even planned, to solve something that wasn't actually urgent. And if someone asked you in that moment, why don't you just rest? The honest answer would be surprisingly difficult to put into words. Because it's not that you don't want to rest. It's that something inside your system simply won't stop, even when you tell it to. Even when you're genuinely exhausted. Even when you rationally know that resting would be good for you. The most common explanations for this pattern are familiar. Productivity addiction, workaholism, an inability to switch off in a culture that glorifies being busy. Those explanations aren't wrong, but they stay on the surface. Because they describe the behavior without touching the more important question. Why is one specific part of the nervous system unwilling to trust slowing down? And what exactly does that part believe it's protecting? Over decades of clinical work, psychologist Richard Schwartz developed a model that fundamentally changed the way an entire generation of therapists understands the human mind. He called it internal family systems. The central idea is simple. The human psyche is not a single unified entity with one internal voice. It is a system made up of multiple parts, each with its own perspective, its own function, and its own history of why that function developed. Some of those parts Schwartz called managers. They are proactive, organized, control-oriented parts. They work before any problem appears, trying to keep the system functioning, productive, socially acceptable, and away from situations of vulnerability. Other parts he called firefighters. These are reactive parts that jump into action whenever something threatens the system's internal balance, usually quickly and intensely. And there is a third group that Schwartz called exiles. These are the parts that carry old memories, emotions, or beliefs, often painful ones, that the system learned, at some point, to keep at a distance. What connects all three groups is a very clear internal logic. Managers and firefighters exist, to a large extent, to protect the system from coming into contact with what the exiles are carrying. Now apply this model to the part that never stops. Constant busyness is rarely just a habit or a preference. In most cases, it serves a managerial function. It is a part that learned, somewhere in the system's history, that keeping the body and mind constantly moving is an effective way of keeping the system out of reach of something much harder to face. Not consciously, not as a deliberate decision, as an automatic strategy that developed in response to something that, at one point, was both real and necessary. Think about what happens to a child who grows up in an unpredictable environment, where being too still could be risky, where staying available, active, and useful kept the system away from conflict, where activity was, quite literally, safer than rest. That system learns something fundamental. Movement means control. Productivity means worth. Busyness means safety. And that learning doesn't disappear when the external environment changes. It becomes embedded in the architecture of the nervous system as part of its baseline. Researchers Peter Sterling and Joseph Ayer, who introduced the concept of allostasis, the body's ability to adapt by recalibrating its own internal operating parameters, showed that this recalibration is not merely metaphorical, it is physiological. A nervous system that has operated in a state of heightened activation for long enough doesn't simply become accustomed to that state. It begins to treat it as normal. And any drop below that recalibrated level, any slowing down at all, is registered as something unusual. What this means in practice is that for a system whose default mode is constant busyness, genuine rest doesn't feel relaxing. It feels unfamiliar, slightly disorienting, as if something were missing, even when nothing is missing. But there is something even more specific happening here, because allostatic recalibration explains why rest feels unfamiliar. What it still doesn't explain is why, for so many people, simply sitting still and doing nothing for a few minutes can produce a discomfort that goes far beyond unfamiliarity. A discomfort that feels urgent, that feels like it needs to be fixed, that somehow feels dangerous. To understand where that particular sense of urgency comes from, we have to look at what the mind does when the outside world finally becomes quiet. And what the research discovered in that quiet space completely changes the way we understand why the part that never stops exists. In 2014, psychologist Timothy Wilson of the University of Virginia published a study that would become one of the most cited and one of the most uncomfortable in contemporary psychology. The experiment was simple. Participants were left alone in an empty room for 6 to 15 minutes. No phone, no books, no external stimulation of any kind. The only instruction was, stay here alone with your own thoughts. What Wilson found was that most people experienced this as genuinely difficult, uncomfortable in ways they hadn't expected, hard to sustain, even for short periods of time. But the finding that attracted the most attention was something else. In one variation of the experiment, participants had the option of giving themselves small electric shocks during the silent waiting period. The shocks were mild, unpleasant, but not painful. And yet, a significant number of participants chose to shock themselves rather than simply sit alone with their own thoughts. The easiest interpretation of this finding is that people are afraid of silence. But Wilson proposed a more precise explanation. The problem isn't silence. It's what emerges in silence. When external input is removed, the mind doesn't automatically come to rest. It turns inward. And for many nervous systems, what exists in that inner space has never been fully processed. Old emotions left unresolved. Questions that were postponed instead of answered. Sensations that constant busyness had kept outside conscious awareness. Any external stimulation, almost any stimulation at all, feels more manageable than unexpectedly encountering that internal material. That's why the electric shock. That's why the phone is picked up in less than 2 minutes. That's why a new task gets invented on the very first day of vacation. This isn't weakness, it's a system doing exactly what it learned to do in order to stay out of reach of something it doesn't yet know how to move through. But there is a second layer to this pattern that goes beyond individual psychology. It is cultural. And it reinforces the individual nervous system in ways that rarely become visible. Researcher Sylvia Bellezza of Columbia University conducted a series of studies documenting something that almost anyone living in a modern urban culture will immediately recognize. In Western societies, especially over the past few decades, busyness has become a status symbol, not merely a condition, a symbol, saying, "I'm incredibly busy. I don't have time for anything. My schedule is completely full," communicates at an implicit but remarkably consistent level that a person is important, that they are in demand, that they have value in the marketplace, in relationships, and within the social hierarchy. What Bellezza documented is that this association, busyness equals importance, is reflected not only in public statements, but also in the way people evaluate themselves internally. A day without measurable productivity doesn't simply feel empty. For many systems, it feels like evidence of diminished worth. And once busyness becomes tied to a person's sense of value, slowing down is no longer just about resting. It quietly becomes a feeling of becoming less. Think about how this shows up in everyday life. Someone retires after decades of work and, within a few months, feels anxious, disoriented, and urgently begins searching for something to contribute. Not because they love the work itself, but because without it, their identity has nowhere to land. A professional takes medical leave and, despite being explicitly told to rest, continues answering messages at 10 o'clock at night because completely disconnecting from work creates an anxiety that the illness itself never did. Someone spends the weekend supposedly resting, but arrives on Monday even more exhausted than they were on Friday because that rest was filled with a parallel list of household, family, and personal tasks that kept the system operating in exactly the same mode. A parent whose children are settled and whose home is finally in order suddenly has no idea what to do with themselves for more than 20 minutes. Not because they lack interests, but because being actively needed was what gave the day its structure and meaning. In every one of these examples, the pattern isn't laziness in reverse, nor is it excessive ambition. It is a system whose functional identity, who it believes itself to be in terms of purpose and role, has become so deeply intertwined with doing that simply being has become almost inaccessible, not by choice, by construction. And here is something that completely changes how this entire pattern can be understood. The part that never stops is not the problem. At one point, it was the solution. It solved something. It protected the system from something that, in that context, there simply weren't enough resources to face. The question isn't how to eliminate that part. The question is, what is it protecting? And does it still need to protect you in the same way today? If this describes something you've recognized in your own nervous system, that feeling that slowing down is much harder than it should be, this channel exists to put words to exactly that experience. Subscribe so the next video will already be waiting for you. But there is an even deeper layer to this story, because so far we've explored what the system does to avoid silence. What we haven't yet explored is what silence might actually reveal, and why the possibility of encountering it creates a resistance that goes far beyond simply feeling uncomfortable with stillness. There is a line of research in psychology that rarely appears in conversations about productivity or busyness, yet it may be one of the most revealing when it comes to understanding why slowing down is difficult in ways that go far beyond habit. In the 1980s, researchers Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pyszczynski developed what became known as terror management theory. The theory begins with an observation about the human condition that is both simple and impossible to ignore. Human beings are the only animals capable of anticipating their own mortality. We know, with some degree of certainty, that we are going to die, without knowing when, without knowing how, and without being able to prevent it. According to the theory, a great deal of human behavior is, in one way or another, a response to that awareness, not necessarily in dramatic or conscious ways, but as a silent background force that organizes many of the choices and patterns people develop throughout their lives. Terror management theory proposes that people develop psychological buffers against this existential awareness, beliefs that provide meaning, systems of value, a sense of belonging to something greater than themselves, and, particularly relevant to what we're exploring here, the feeling that life is being used productively, that there is contribution, progress, achievement. From this perspective, constant busyness isn't just a productivity habit, it's also a way of managing the most difficult question there is. What am I doing here, and does it matter? As long as the system stays busy, that question never has enough space to fully take shape. There is always another task, another goal, another deadline. The question never has enough silence to become audible. And when silence finally arrives, when the system finally stops, that question begins to emerge, not necessarily as words, often as a vague feeling, a discomfort without a name, a restlessness that can't identify what it's looking for. But terror management theory operates at a fairly broad level. What Richard Schwartz's model offers, and what feels much more immediate and personal, is a way of understanding what the exiles are carrying. Because in every system that uses busyness as a protective strategy, there is something specific that constant activity is keeping at a distance. Not something abstract, something deeply personal, something rooted in that individual's history. For some systems, what the exiles carry is loneliness. Not the loneliness of being physically alone, the loneliness of never having truly been seen at an important moment in life by someone who truly mattered. And constant movement ensures there is never enough silence for that old loneliness to fully surface. For others, what lies beneath is a profound sense of inadequacy hidden underneath every accomplishment. The feeling, never fully articulated, yet always present, that if the system ever stopped producing and achieving, what remained simply wouldn't be enough. That beneath all the accomplishments and success there is something that, if truly seen, would disappoint. And busyness ensures that layer is never tested. For others still, it is an old sadness, a loss that was only partially processed, a pain that was managed rather than moved through, waiting, with a patience the nervous system itself does not possess, for the space that never seems to arrive. Think about what this looks like in real life. Someone decides to meditate for the first time. Within the first few minutes of silence, they are flooded with thoughts that seem to come from every direction. They interpret this as failure, as proof that their mind is too restless, that they are incapable of being still. But what is often happening isn't failure. It's the system, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, finding enough space for what has been waiting to finally appear. The thoughts aren't showing up because meditation is going wrong. They appear because silence is an opening that the exiles never waste. Or think about someone who reaches a period of tremendous professional success, real achievements, real recognition, and yet, whenever the noise quiets down, they are met with a sadness that makes no rational sense, because success never reaches what the exiles are carrying. And the busyness required to maintain that success kept the system far enough away from those exiles that the distance itself began to feel like normal life. Or consider someone who becomes ill. The body forces them to stop because the nervous system never accepted the invitation to slow down voluntarily. During the first days of forced rest, they experience a wave of emotions that seem completely disproportionate to the illness itself. Tears with no obvious cause. A sense of emptiness with no clear object. A sadness they cannot name. The illness didn't create those emotions. The illness created the space, and the exiles finally found an opening to emerge. This is where the resistance to slowing down reveals its most honest logic. The part that never stops isn't being irrational. It's being completely consistent with what it learned. If slowing down means all of this begins to surface, and if the system never developed the resources needed to move through what the exiles are carrying, then not slowing down really is the safest strategy available. Not because it's the best strategy, because it's the only strategy the system knows, and that changes the question entirely. The question is no longer, how do I force myself to slow down? The real question becomes, how does the system develop enough trust for slowing down to stop feeling like a threat? The difference between those two questions is enormous, and the answer to the second one changes everything about what becomes possible. One of the most important distinctions Richard Schwartz's model offers is the difference between being a part and having a part. When the system is completely identified with the part that refuses to slow down, when the voice saying, "I need to keep doing something," is the only voice available in that moment, there is no perspective on it. It doesn't feel like one part of the system. It feels like the entire system. It feels like reality. And trying to turn off that part in those moments is like trying to turn yourself off. Schwartz called this state blending. The system becomes so fused with the part that the distinction between me and this part disappears. What he proposes, and what decades of clinical work with this model have consistently documented, is that change does not happen by forcing the part to stop. It happens by creating enough distance for the system to relate to it, not by being it, by having it, by asking it questions, by understanding what it is protecting, and whether, in this particular moment, that protection is still necessary. This process, which Schwartz called unblending, is not a relaxation technique. It is a process of recognition. The part that refuses to slow down does not need to be convinced that it is wrong. It needs to be recognized for what it is. A part that has worked tirelessly, for a very long time, to keep the system functioning. A part that took on a responsibility that was probably never meant to be its own. A part that learned, in circumstances where it made perfect sense, that movement meant protection. When the system is able to approach this part with curiosity instead of frustration, criticism, or attempts to suppress it, something begins to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way that is real and measurable. The part gradually begins to loosen its grip when it realizes the system has resources available beyond itself. When it recognizes that the central self, what Schwartz calls the self, is present and capable of meeting whatever emerges in the silence. When it discovers that its protective role no longer needs to operate full-time. This is also where allostatic recalibration becomes deeply practical. The nervous system's baseline does not recalibrate through decisions. It recalibrates through repeated experience. Each time the system slows down, voluntarily, with some awareness of what it is doing, and whatever emerges in the silence is experienced without anything catastrophic happening. The system records that experience, not as an intellectual belief, as physiological evidence. I stopped. It felt difficult, but it wasn't the end. With enough repetition, those experiences begin to accumulate. The protective part gradually receives evidence that it no longer has to function as if every moment were an emergency. And the threshold at which the system can tolerate genuine rest, real rest, without replacing it with compensatory activity, slowly begins to shift, not because the part has been eliminated, because it has been recognized. And because the system has gradually developed the capacity to remain with what that part was protecting, without needing constant movement to keep it at a distance. This does not happen quickly. It does not happen in a straight line. And it does not happen through willpower. It happens through a combination of recognition, repetition, and, very often, the support of another regulated presence, whether in therapy or in a trusted relationship. Because a part of the system that learned stopping was unsafe rarely unlearns that lesson entirely on its own. It needs enough lived experiences of discovering that, when it finally stopped and the silence arrived, there was someone or something present to help it move through that silence safely. Subscribe to follow what comes next. Because the next video takes this journey into a direction that connects everything explored throughout the last several episodes in a way that very few people expect. The internal family systems model, developed by Richard Schwartz over decades of clinical practice, proposes that the human psyche is made up of multiple parts with distinct roles, including manager parts, which work proactively to keep the system functional and away from vulnerability, and exiled parts, which carry unresolved emotional material the system learned to keep out of awareness. Within this framework, the part that refuses to slow down is a manager part, not a problem to eliminate, but a protective strategy that developed in response to something that was once real and necessary. The concept of allostasis, developed by Peter Sterling and Joseph Iyer and later expanded by Bruce McEwen, explains why a nervous system that remains in a state of high activation for long enough recalibrates that state as its new baseline. As a result, genuine rest can feel unfamiliar, subtly disorienting, or even threatening, not because of a lack of willingness, but because the nervous system truly experiences it as a departure from what it has come to define as normal. The 2014 study, Just Think: The Challenges of the Disengaged Mind, conducted by Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia, documented that most people experience significant discomfort when left alone with their own thoughts without external stimulation, and that this discomfort can become so intense that many prefer negative stimulation to internal stillness. For many nervous systems, what emerges in silence is precisely the material that constant busyness has kept outside conscious awareness. Sylvia Belezza's research at Columbia University on what she termed conspicuous consumption of time demonstrated that in contemporary Western cultures, busyness has become a status symbol. This cultural association between being busy and being valuable reinforces an internal equation in which doing nothing is unconsciously experienced as becoming less valuable or somehow inadequate. Terror management theory, developed by Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pischinsky, and inspired by Ernest Becker's work, proposes that awareness of mortality creates a background layer of existential anxiety. Productivity, busyness, and a sense of contribution can function as psychological buffers against that anxiety, keeping the system away from the deepest questions that silence has the power to bring into awareness. The concepts of blending and unblending, central to Schwartz's model, distinguish between being a part, being so identified with it that it feels like your entire identity, and having a part, maintaining enough perspective to relate to it with curiosity. Lasting change in the part that refuses to slow down does not come through suppression. It comes through unblending, creating enough space to ask what that part is protecting, and whether that protection is still needed now. Within this context, allostatic recalibration occurs not through decisions or intellectual insight, but through repeated experience. Every time the system slows down and what emerges in the silence is experienced without catastrophe, the nervous system records new physiological evidence. Over time, those experiences gradually shift the threshold at which genuine rest is recognized as safe. If any part of this video described something you recognized, that feeling that slowing down is harder than it should be, that the part of you that refuses to stop seems to have a life of its own beyond your conscious decisions, leave a comment. Just one word. Whatever stayed with you. Because recognizing that this part exists, and that it has a reason for existing, is the beginning of a different relationship with it. But something fascinating begins to happen at the end of this journey, when the system slowly develops enough trust to start slowing down. When that happens, What once seemed impossible starts becoming real. Good news begins to arrive. Life improves. Moments of clarity, real rest, genuine connection. Rationally, you can see that things are getting better. And yet, almost cruelly, something in the nervous system still cannot completely believe it. The good news is received. It is acknowledged, but for days, sometimes weeks, it never fully lands. It never feels as real as it should, as though the system is still waiting for one more piece of evidence that somehow never feels sufficient. It is not ingratitude. It is not an inability to experience joy. It is a nervous system that has been calibrated to confirm danger far more quickly than it confirms safety. Why does good news take so long to feel real? And what does the nervous system need, beyond words, to finally register that the danger has passed? That is the next video.